Hello and welcome to Revelations in Grace. I'm John Paul, and today we're going to attempt to identify Gog and Magog in the book of Revelation. We hear about these two nations in Revelation chapter 20, in the middle of the chapter. Let's read it for context. And after the 1,000 years, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to the war, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. They went up over the width of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. Fire came down out of heaven from God and devoured them, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are also. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. I discussed the millennium in previous videos, timing the millennium's end and the 40-year millennium, and I believe this period wasn't a literal 1,000 years, but it symbolized the days of the Messiah, the 6th millennium and the earth's 7 ages, and that this period was much shorter and even expected to be 40 years by the early Jewish rabbis and some of the early Christians. They saw it as a transition period from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, from the Old World to the New World, and paralleled the Israelites coming out of Egypt and entering into the Promised Land during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And if you want to see my reasoning for that and the scriptures I use, check out some of those past videos so you can hear more about that. But during this period, Satan was bound so that he should deceive the nations no more until those years were finished. And I don't believe this was a complete binding. I believe he was still able to deceive people, but he wasn't able to cause nationwide conflict to war against Christianity. And that's exactly what he does when he comes out of this millennium. He goes and deceives the nations Gog and Magog to persecute the camp of the saints. Now, the saints in Revelation, that refers to Christians. It says earlier in the book that it's those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. So it refers to those who believe in Jesus. And the reason it calls them a camp is because they don't have walls to protect them. These aren't an established people with their own cities. Christians were scattered all throughout the Roman Empire and were vulnerable to attack. And Satan comes against the beloved city. And I believe this represents the New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, the kingdom of heaven. And these saints, when they put their faith in Christ, they were part of that city wherever they dwelt in the Roman Empire. And Satan was attacking the city by attacking God's people. But of course, fire comes out of heaven from God and devours them and prevents them from carrying out the full extent of their plans. And the devil who deceives them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur. So let's try to identify who these nations were. Throughout the book of Revelation, unbelieving Jerusalem is referred to as Egypt and Sodom and Babylon due to its hostility towards God's new people, the church. In Matthew 23, Jesus charged the Pharisees with the blood of the prophets and the saints, that they were going to be guilty of it, and that they were going to slay the prophets he would send to them in those coming years. And in Revelation 11, we hear that the city where Jesus was crucified is symbolically called Sodom and Egypt. So he refers to unbelieving Jerusalem as Sodom and Egypt. And that same city later is referred to as Babylon. Well, why did this happen? In the Old Covenant, Israel was attacked by these empires. Egypt and Babylon enslaved the Jews, and they were their enemies. They were beastly towards these Jews. And God delivered them He delivered them from them. He rescued them from Egypt, rescued them from Babylon in the end. And now in the new covenant, Jesus had died on the cross and established a new covenant, and with it, a new covenant people, Christianity. Christians are now God's new people, and it's made up of the remnant of believing Jews, and it's made up of believing Gentiles. And unfortunately, in the first century, they also had enemies, and it was namely unbelieving Jerusalem, and later on, it was unbelieving Rome. And they acted as enemies of this new people of God. And that's why Revelation refers to them as Egypt and Sodom and Babylon, because they were hostile towards God's new people. Not only that, but John brought up these stories to encourage Christians and to recall bring to remembrance these stories and how God delivered his people in the past from these empires as a reminder that God would do the same for them in this time. For instance, Jezebel is brought up to remind the Christians that just as God delivered the Jews from Jezebel, he would deliver the Christians from whatever this Jezebel represented in their time. And he recalled Egypt, Sodom, Babylon again. And God is saying, remember how God delivered us from these people? He will do the same now in the same way. So I believe uh, just accordingly, Gog and Magog refer to unbelieving Jerusalem and Rome when they acted as enemies of the church in that first century. And they were both destroyed by fire. Jerusalem was destroyed by fire in the siege of Jerusalem. And when the Romans hurled flaming balls and flaming sulfur onto the city and destroyed it and burned down the temple, and Rome was later attacked. Two coastline cities were destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which was a volcano in Italy, and brought fire down from heaven in front of them. And I believe this seems a fulfillment of Romans 2:9. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Greek. Now, Revelation isn't the only place in Scripture where we learn of Gog and Magog. These two nations were also mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And Robert Cruikshank, he's done some fantastic research on this. He builds on the work of Gary DeMar and James Jordan, and he establishes a connection between Ezekiel, Esther, the story of Esther, and Revelation. And he believes that it's being brought into Revelation to remind people of what happened in the story of Esther. Now, Ezekiel 38 and 39, its prophecy of Gog and Magog, finds its fulfillment in the events of the book of Esther, which came to pass approximately 90 years after that prophecy. For instance, you can see how Gog's evil plan against the Jews living in unwalled villages in Ezekiel 38 finds a parallel in Haman's plan to wipe out the Jews who at that particular moment were living in unwalled villages. And it was the only time between the prophecy of Ezekiel and the first century when the Jews were living in unwalled villages. So it was the best candidate for that fulfillment. We find out in Ezekiel 38 that Gog's desire to seize spoil and carry off plunder from Israel aligns with Haman's intention to seize their possessions as plunder. Gog's pursuit of Israel's silver and gold corresponds to Haman's promise to pay off Persia's treasuries with silver plundered from the Jews. The burial place of Gog is called Haman Gog in Ezekiel 39, which is reminiscent of Haman. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Haman is referred to as a Gogite. In Esther 3:10, he's called an Agagite. But in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, he's called an Agagite. He was a descendant of Gog. And John brings these to mind in the book of Revelation to tell Christians, remember the story of Esther and how God saved the Jews back then. He's going to save you now in the same way. Now, if you recall from the story of Esther, Haman conspired with the king of Persia to exterminate the Jews, and he did this in the 12th year of King Xerxes around 474 BC. But the plan backfired, and the Jews were delivered when King Xerxes turned against Haman. Well, we find out that this is happening, a parallel of it is happening in the first century as well. In 64 AD, unbelieving Jews conspired with Roman Emperor Nero to annihilate the Christians, but their plan fails because Rome turns against the Jews and it leads to the deliverance of the Christians. So I want to thank Robert Cruikshank for doing this amazing research and allowing me to share his material. And you can find his other material like it on his YouTube channel, Burroughs of Berea. Well, not Burroughs of Berea. He does Berean Bible Church, and he has a blog on Burroughs of Berea. So check him out. He's got some great stuff. But I believe this was the time that Satan was released, around 64 AD. He was expected to wage war against the saints, and this occurred when Nero used the Roman state to persecute Christians. Now, Christian persecution existed in small measures before 64 AD. The Roman Empire had been ambivalent towards Christians. However, in mid November of that year, the Neronian persecution began, with the sword of Caesar being used against Christians for the first time. This is what early church theologian Tertullian said of that time in his book Apology, chapter 5. He says, Caesar Tiberius, accordingly, in whose days the Christian name made its entry into the world, having himself received intelligence from Palestine of events which had clearly shown the truth of Christ's divinity, brought the matter before the Senate with his own decision in favor of Christ. The Senate, because it had not given the approval itself, rejected his proposal. Caesar held to his opinion, threatening wrath against all accusers of the Christians. Consult your histories. You will find there that Nero was the first who assailed with the imperial sword the Christian sect, making progress then, especially at Rome. But we glory in having our condemnation hallowed by the hostility of such a wretch, for anyone who knows him can understand that not except of being of singular excellence did anything bring on it Nero's condemnation. So this is remarkable. What he was saying is that Rome was not against Christianity at first. They tried to legalize their religion. And what's his name? Tiberius. He even protected the Christians from accusation. And it wasn't until later that Nero decided to use the Roman Empire to go after Christians. And he was the first Caesar to do that. And you can recall the story of Acts, where the Jews were frequently persecuting the Christians, and sometimes the Romans would step in and protect the Christians, and they'd throw them in jail for their protection. And Paul often used his Roman citizenship to protect him from some of the persecution he was facing from his own people. So what happened to turn Nero against the Christians? Well, it started with a fire that broke out in Rome. And it destroyed so much of Rome. It was awful. And a lot of people thought Nero was the one who started the fire. But the Jewish section of the city didn't burn down. So people were also suspicious that maybe the Jews had started it. And Nero had a Jewish wife, Poppaea. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But there is some historical evidence to suggest that these unbelieving Jews, in order to divert suspicion away from themselves and Nero, instigated Nero through his wife to blame the fire of Rome on the Christians. And so Nero was able to escape the anger of the people by making Christians the enemy of the human race. And for the next 3.5 years, Christians were hunted down and subject to widespread and brutal torture. It began around mid-November of 64 AD and didn't end until the death of Nero in mid-68 AD. Now, this is what a historian in the 1800s had to say about it. Philip Schaff, he writes, under this wanton, that is groundless, charge of incendiarism, backed by the equally groundless charge of misanthropy and unnatural vice, there began a carnival of blood such as even heathen Rome never saw before or since. It was the answer of the powers of hell to the mighty preaching of the two chief apostles, which had shaken heathenism to its center. A vast multitude of Christians was put to death in the most shocking manner. Some were crucified, probably in mockery of the punishment of Christ. Some sewed up in the skins of wild beasts and exposed to the voracity of mad dogs in the arena. The satanic tragedy reached its climax at night in the imperial gardens on the slope of the Vatican, which embraced, it is supposed, the present site of the place and church of St. Peter. Christian men and women, covered with pitch or oil or resin, and nailed to posts of pine, were lighted and burned as torches for the amusement of the mob, while Nero, in fantastic dress, figured in a horse race and displayed his art as a charioteer. Burning alive was the ordinary punishment for incendiaries, but only the cruel ingenuity of this imperial monster, under the inspiration of the devil, could invent such a horrible system of illumination. And notice what Philip Schaff says about this, under the inspiration of the devil. I can think of no better time in history when Satan was released from his binding to deceive the nations into warring against Christianity. He used that connection with Nero and the Jews who conspired together, just like Haman and Xerxes in the story of Esther, to eradicate Christianity. And this was definitely under the inspiration of the devil. That torture was so terrible that it would have been only the devil could have come up with something so horrible like that. Um, yeah. So, and this persecution wasn't limited to Rome itself. According to early Christian historians, Sulpicius Severus and Orosius, living in the late 300s AD, the persecution of Christians during this time extended to the Roman provinces. So Rome persecuted Christians all throughout the provinces as well. Christians were considered enemies of the human race. So this looks like an interesting fulfillment of how Satan was released and deceived Gog and Magog to persecute the saints. Now, if you study Ezekiel chapters 37 through 48 and Revelation chapters 20 through 22, you'll find many striking parallels. You can see here on the screen this chart I have. For instance, Ezekiel in chapter 37 describes a revival of dry bones. And in Revelation 20, it describes the first resurrection. And Ezekiel 37, it describes a reunited kingdom. And in Revelation, it describes how saints rule for 1,000 years. In Ezekiel 38, it describes the Gog and Magog battle, and it does that again in Revelation 20. Ezekiel describes gorging of the birds, and gorging of the birds is also described in Revelation chapter 19. In Ezekiel, the prophet is taken to a high mountain, and this also happens in Revelation when John is taken to a high mountain. In Ezekiel, the temple is measured, and in Revelation 21, the city is measured. In Ezekiel, the temple is full of God's glory, and in Revelation 21, the city is full of God's glory. In Ezekiel, we hear about a river of life, and we hear about that again in Revelation chapter 22. We also hear about trees with healing leaves in Ezekiel, and in Revelation, we hear about a tree with healing leaves in chapter 22. And I believe this points to the idea that Ezekiel was a depiction of what would happen in the end. It prophesied about the story of Esther, but it was also related to what would happen in the end times. You might say it had a dual fulfillment, or at least was a illustration of what was going to happen in the final days. And this is so interesting. And if you recall from Revelation 20, fire comes down out of heaven from God and devours Gog and Magog. So how did this happen? Well, after the nations attacked the saints, after that Neronian persecution, in fact, somewhere in the middle of it, Rome decided to turn against Jerusalem. I believe it was Vespasian and his son Titus went down to Israel. They wanted to destroy Christianity and Judaism. They wanted to destroy both religions. But God gave the Christians a warning of their coming, and they fled to the city of Pella in the desert, in the mountains, and they were safe throughout this destruction. And Rome instead turned its attention to Israel and started attacking Jerusalem. And it was a very horrible time in history, but that gave the Christians the opportunity they needed to escape. Now, Ezekiel 38 prophesies events that seem to have occurred also during this Roman-Jewish war. In Ezekiel 38, verses 21 through 22, it writes, "And I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the Lord God, and every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment upon him with plague and bloodshed, and will pour out torrents of rain, hailstones, fire, and sulfur on him and on his troops and on the many nations with him." And I just want to read a section from what I wrote here about some of the things that were happening during that time. When the Jewish war began, Jews who had been living peacefully among Gentiles in cities across the Roman Empire erupted in conflict against their Gentile neighbors. Both sides feared a preemptive strike from the other. Some Jews aligned with the Gentiles and killed their fellow Jews. In a single day, thousands were slain in various cities. Even the wealthy Jews and Jewish zealots turned against one another, betraying and destroying their own people. Driven by mutual hatred, they denied their brethren the honor of burial, resulting in piles of exposed corpses on the streets and in houses. This dire situation triggered a devastating plague, which worsened when the Jewish zealot factions destroyed each other's food supplies, leading to a dreadful famine. Upon their arrival, the Romans encountered a nation in chaos, with brothers killing brothers. Unbelieving Jews from various nations throughout the Roman Empire had gathered in Jerusalem for the annual Jewish feast and found themselves trapped within the city during the war. As prophesied in Revelation 29, the Romans hurled burning sulfur and massive rocks upon the city, reducing it to ashes and fulfilling the prophecy. So we see how fire did come down from heaven, from God to destroy Gog. And the Romans did believe that they were doing God's bidding, that they believed that God was helping them to win that war, and that God had turned on the Jews in that war. So that's a really interesting fulfillment of that, how they were, how fire came down from heaven and devoured Gog. Well, Magog wasn't spared and Rome wasn't spared. A second incident of fire from heaven took place 9 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote about extraordinary events that occurred in 79 AD, such as the opening of the abyss, the presence of giants roaming the earth and flying through the sky, and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And this is what he writes about it. I'm in Book 66, Section 22. Such as Vesuvius, and these phenomena usually occur there every year. But all the other occurrences that had taken place there in the course of time, however notable, because unusual, they may have seemed to those who on each occasion observed them, nevertheless would be regarded as trivial in comparison with what now happened, even if all had been combined into one. This is what befell. Numbers of huge men, quite surpassing any human stature, such creatures, in fact, as the giants are pictured to have been, that can also be translated as titans, appeared now on the mountain, now in the surrounding country, and again in the cities, wandering over the earth day and night, and also flitting through the air. After this, fearful droughts and a sudden and violent earthquakes occurred, so that the whole plain round about seethed, and the summits leaped into the air. There were frequent rumblings, some of them subterranean, that resembled thunder, and some on the surface that sounded like bellowings. The sea also joined in the roar, and the sky re-echoed it. Then suddenly a portentous crash was heard, as if the mountains were tumbling in ruins, and first huge stones were hurled aloft, rising as high as the very summits. Then came a great quantity of fire and endless smoke, so that the whole atmosphere was obscured, and the sun was entirely hidden as if eclipsed. Thus day was turned into night, and light into darkness. Some thought that the giants were rising again in revolt, for at this time also many of their forms could be discerned in the smoke, and moreover a sound as of trumpets was heard. While others believed that the whole universe was being resolved into chaos or fire. Therefore they fled, some from the houses into the streets, others from outside into the houses, now from the sea to the land, and now from the land to the sea. For in their excitement they regarded any place where they were not as safer than where they were. While this was going on, an inconceivable quantity of ashes was blown out, which covered both sea and land and filled all the air. It brought much injury of various kinds, as chance befell, to men and farms and cattle, and in particular it destroyed all fish and birds. Furthermore, it buried 2 entire cities, Herculaneum and Pompeii, the latter place while its populace was seated in the theater. Indeed, the amount of dust taken all together was so great that some of it reached Africa and Syria and Egypt, and it also reached Rome, filling the air overhead and darkening the sun. There too no little fear was occasioned, that lasted for several days, since the people did not know and could not imagine what had happened, but like those close at hand, believed that the whole world was being turned upside down, that the sun was disappearing into the earth, and that the earth was being lifted to the sky. These ashes now did the Romans no great harm at the time, though later they brought a terrible pestilence upon them. So this would be a really interesting fulfillment of fire coming down from heaven and devouring Magog with this volcanic eruption. What would be a better fulfillment of that? And you'll notice that this fire destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. And this seems to be this seems to be a fulfillment of Ezekiel chapter 39. In verse 6 it says, "I will send fire on Magog and on those who dwell securely in the coastlands, and they will know that I am the Lord." Well, if you look at this map right here, here's a map of Western Italy, and you see Mount Vesuvius right here, and you see Herculaneum right on the edge of the sea, and Pompeii right on the coastline of Italy, which would be a stunning fulfillment of this verse, how God sends fire on Magog and on those who dwell securely in the coastlands. So another interesting parallel between the prophecy of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel and the events of the first century. Not only that, but the Romans interpreted this volcanic eruption as the wrath of God. They didn't think it was just a coincidence. In the Syllabine Oracles, Book 4, which is a poem about this event, the author writes, "But when from deep cleft of Italian land fire shall come flashing forth in the broad heaven, and many cities burn and men destroy, and much black ashes shall fill the great sky, and small drops like red earth shall fall from heaven, then know the anger of the God of heaven." So he calls that destruction, that violent eruption of of the volcano, the anger of the God in heaven. So they interpreted this as fire, not just coming down from heaven, but from God, as Revelation 20 states. That's a really powerful fulfillment of that. Well, we also learn in Revelation 20 that the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur. And this is so interesting because Pliny the Younger, he was a Roman historian living at that time. He wrote some letters. And in book 6 of his letters, he describes what happened during this volcano. And in it, he states that many people stopped believing in their deities. They believed their deities no longer existed at this time. He says, "You could hear the wailing of women, the screams of little children, and the shouts of men. Some were trying to find their parents, and others their children, others their wives, by calling for them and recognizing them by their voices alone. Some were commiserating their own lot, others that of their relatives, while some again prayed for death in sheer terror of dying. Many were lifting up their hands to the gods, but more were declaring that now there were no more gods, and that this night would last forever and the end of all the world." So even those who worshipped false gods in that time were declaring that there were no more gods. And if you recall, in the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius, you saw giants, maybe the Titans, flitting through the air at that time. This is just speculation, but maybe one of those was Satan. Maybe he was being bound by the angels and cast into Mount Vesuvius. Maybe he was being thrown into a lake of fire. Maybe that's too literal a fulfillment, because we know Satan is primarily an invisible being, but it's worth noting at least. But a stronger point is the one I just made, that people who worshiped false gods at that time stopped believing in their gods. They stopped believing that those gods existed at this time, which was really powerful. And not only that, but the following year after Mount Vesuvius erupted, a gigantic fire burned down large portions of Rome, including numerous satanic temples. And the fire was so great that the people believed it was sent by God himself. Cassius Dio writes, "However, a second conflagration, that is a fire, above ground in the following year spread over very large sections of Rome, while Titus was absent in Campania attending to the catastrophe that had befallen that region. It consumed the temple of Serapis, the temple of Isis, the Septa, the temple of Neptune, the baths of Agrippa, the Pantheon, the Derivatorium, the theater of Balbus, the stage building of Pompey's theater, the Octavian buildings together with their books, and the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus with their surrounding temples. Hence, the disaster seemed not to be of human, but of divine origin. For anyone can estimate from the list of buildings that I have given how many others must have been destroyed. So, this fire destroyed so many satanic temples in Rome that they thought it was sent by God Himself, that it was a divine disaster. And this would have also symbolized the defeat of Satan and his casting into the lake of fire. We have the giants uh, appearing around the time that the volcano erupted. We have the fact that people stopped believing and worshiping these gods around that time. And we have the fact that this fire came in and destroyed all of uh, demonic and false god temples. And that would have nicely fulfilled the passage that the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire. So I hope you're able to follow all of that. Uh, Basically, I believe that uh, Gog and Magog represented faithless Jerusalem and unbelieving Rome when they were persecuting Christianity during that first century. And I believe that John recalls the prophecies of Gog and Magog and their fulfillment in the story of Esther to remind the Christians. Do you remember how in the story of Esther, Haman conspired with Xerxes to wipe out the Christians, and how God protected the Christians by having Xerxes, or to wipe out the Jews, and God protected the Jews by having King Xerxes turn on Haman? The same is going to happen now in the same way, and that is what happened. The Jews, the unbelieving Jews, conspired with Nero to blame the fire on the Christians and wipe out the Christians. But later the Christians escaped, and Rome turned on Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem with fire. And then the volcano of Mount Vesuvius erupted and did great damage to Rome and brought down that fire from heaven upon Rome for persecuting the Christians. And so that's why I believe he calls Jerusalem and Rome Gog and Magog in the same spirit that he called them Sodom and Egypt and Babylon. So that is a fascinating fulfillment of that. And in a future video, we're going to discuss how Satan was defeated, how thoroughly or completely he was defeated, if demons or fallen angels were defeated at the same time, and how thoroughly they were defeated. So I hope to do that in the next video. Now, with everything, I ask that you pray and research these things for yourself and find out if these things be true. I know there are other Bible scholars and people who research these things who've come to different conclusions, who, even though they believe these things were fulfilled in the first century, they might have a different interpretation on who Gog and Magog were. And I highly recommend you check out their content and see what other people are saying about the issue. But hopefully, this provides at least one way of demonstrating that these prophecies were fulfilled on time when they were promised to occur. So thanks for watching, and I hope you stay tuned for the next video. And if you appreciated this video, let me know. So thank you, and I hope you have a great day.